The wind had a way of carrying secrets across the open fields, brushing over fences and stirring the dust that had settled on the long, winding road leading back to her family's land. Anyone passing through would have noticed how quiet everything seemed, how nothing moved except an old weathered sign that creaked with every gust. It was the kind of silence that made a person wonder what had happened there and why it felt like the world was holding its breath. This was the road she once knew better than her own heartbeat, yet now it felt uncertain, as if it no longer recognized her. Still, she followed it, her boots kicking up pale dirt as she took each step with caution. Before all this, her life had been simple. Early mornings with the sun stretching across the fields, the soft neigh of her loyal horse greeting her before she even reached the barn, and the steady rhythm of home keeping her grounded. But everything changed the day she was taken away. It happened so fast she could barely understand it. A misunderstanding, they said. A terrible mix-up that dropped her into a place she never imagined she would see. The reformatory had thick walls and gates that clanged shut like they were swallowing people whole. She tried to explain from the start. She told them she didn't belong there, that someone had mistaken her for someone else. Her words were brushed aside as if the truth did not matter. She still remembered the first night there, lying awake on a thin mattress that smelled of age and loneliness. She listened to the echoing footsteps of guards and the restless whispers of girls who had been there far longer. She felt trapped and forgotten, caught in a place where time moved slowly, turning days into long shadows. The feeling of helplessness pressed against her chest every night, making her wonder if she would ever see home again. What kept her steady was the memory of her horse, the way he used to press his warm muzzle into her shoulder and wait patiently for her in the fields. She held on to that memory like a lifeline, reminding herself that she had something worth returning to. The days dragged into weeks, and the weeks slipped into months. She did what she was told and tried not to draw attention to herself. Some of the girls there had tough shells, hard from years of being pushed around. Others were quiet, moving through the halls like ghosts. In time she learned how to blend in, though she never stopped hoping that someone would finally realize the mistake and set things right. Each time her name was called for chores or checkups, a part of her hoped they were about to tell her she could go home. That moment didn't come for a long time. Then one day the head matron summoned her. The woman's stern face made it impossible to guess what she was thinking. She handed her a stack of papers and told her that the truth had finally come out. Her record was being cleared and she would be released. No apology, no explanation. Just a door opening and a path leading out. She couldn't even celebrate because shock had taken over, leaving her numb. She walked through the gates with the same clothes she had arrived in, her heart racing as the fresh air hit her face. She had imagined this moment so many times, yet now that it had come, she felt unsure if she could trust it. As she headed toward home, the weight of everything she'd missed pressed heavily inside her. She wondered what had changed in her absence. She thought of her family and the fear they must have felt when she vanished without warning. She thought of the land that had shaped her, the quiet barns, the cracked fences, the deep prints her horse left in the dirt. There had been rumors among the girls in the reformatory, whispers that life outside didn't wait for anyone. That people moved on, land was sold, animals forgotten. She tried to push those thoughts away, but they clung to her, making her footsteps slow and uneasy. The sun was sinking low when she reached the edge of her family's property. She froze. Fences that once stood tall were leaning. Grass that used to be neatly cut grew wild. The barn door hung half open like it had been left that way months ago. Her breath tightened in her chest. This was not the home she remembered. She stepped forward, every muscle tense as she took in the sight. Something had happened here. Something she wasn't prepared for. She hurried toward the house, hoping she was mistaken. The porch boards groaned under her weight. She knocked on the door even though she didn't need to. She pushed it open and felt her stomach twist. Inside, everything was dusty and untouched. Furniture sat where it always had, but there was a stillness to it that felt wrong. She called out, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. No reply came. There were no letters on the table, no sign of where her family had gone or why the house stood abandoned. She stepped back outside, her heart pounding. She felt a wave of panic rising, each thought pushing harder than the last. Had something happened to her family while she was locked away? Had they left because they believed she would never return? She forced herself to breathe and look toward the fields. If she couldn't find answers in the house, there was only one place left to check: the barn. She walked slowly toward it, her palms damp with fear. The closer she got, the stronger her emotions churned. She pushed the barn door fully open, bracing herself for disappointment. The inside was dim, with beams of sunlight cutting through cracks in the walls. Dust floated through the air in soft swirls. The smell of hay and wood hit her, familiar yet faded. Then she heard it, a soft shuffle, a sound she had not expected. Her breath hitched as she stepped deeper into the barn. In the far corner near the old stall gate stood her horse, her loyal companion. His coat was a little rough and his mane tangled, but he lifted his head the moment he sensed her. His eyes locked on hers, recognizing her instantly. She felt her knees weaken with the rush of relief that washed over her. She whispered his name and he moved toward her, hooves dragging across the dusty floor. She reached out slowly, afraid the moment would break if she moved too fast. When her hand touched his muzzle, she felt warmth flood through her. He nudged her gently, as if scolding her for being gone so long. Tears stung her eyes. She didn't know how he had survived or who had been caring for him in her absence, but he was there, he had waited. Among everything lost, he was the one thing still holding on. She leaned her forehead against his, feeling her heartbeat settle for the first time since she walked out of the reformatory gates. Relief mixed with questions. Why was the house empty? Where had her family gone? Why was the land left in this state? The presence of her horse gave her strength, but it didn't erase the mystery that now surrounded her life. As she stood there in the fading light, she sensed something shifting in the air. The wind seemed to carry a message she couldn't quite understand, like the fields were trying to warn her. She knew her story wasn't about to settle into peace just yet. Something bigger was waiting. Something tied to the reason her family disappeared and the long months she spent behind the wrong set of walls. She closed her eyes for a moment, her hand resting against the steady rise and fall of her horse's breath. When she opened them again, she felt a new determination settle inside her. She had come home to loss, but she also came home to loyalty. Whatever had gone wrong, whatever had been taken from her, she was ready to uncover the truth. What she didn't know was that the truth would shake everything she believed and pull her deeper into a mystery far more complicated than a simple mistake. Something was hidden on this land, something someone wanted to keep buried. And now that she was back, the past was no longer willing to stay silent. The door behind her creaked with the wind, and she turned sharply, sensing movement. She couldn't see anyone there, but she felt watched. It wasn't the kind of feeling she could ignore. The emptiness of the property suddenly felt too heavy, too carefully quiet. She knew she wasn't alone. And that was the moment she realized her struggle wasn't over yet. It was only beginning. She kept her hand on her horse's neck for a while, steadying herself as the last of the sunlight faded. The shadows stretched across the barn floor in long, uneven shapes, reminding her how much time had been lost. She had left this place when the world was warm and steady, and now she had returned to land that felt colder and filled with questions that tugged at her nerves. Her horse shifted his weight and nudged her again, as if urging her to move, to look around, to face whatever waited for her outside the safety of the barn. She stepped back and tried to gather her thoughts. The emptiness of the house, the silence around the fields, the neglected fences, and now that strange feeling of being watched. All of it pushed against her mind with a kind of quiet force. She reminded herself that fear would not help her find answers. She ran a hand across her horse's shoulder, promising silently that she wouldn't leave him again, not for anything she couldn't fight. She opened the stall just enough for him to step out and walk freely in the barn. He circled once, sniffing the air, then returned to her side like he understood she needed him close. The barn still held familiar scents, but something had changed. She noticed a few things that didn't belong there. A pile of tools stacked in a way her family never used. Fresh footprints in the dust that were not hers. An old lantern hanging from a nail, but still warm as if someone had used it recently. She moved closer to it, feeling the faint heat. Someone had been here within hours, maybe less. She swallowed hard. Whoever it was, they were either watching the place or using it for reasons she didn't understand. She stepped out of the barn, scanning the open land around her. The sky had deepened into night, leaving only a thin band of color on the horizon. She felt the air grow cooler, brushing against her arms. Her horse leaned his head out the door, watching her as if ready to follow. She took a slow breath and walked toward the well near the center of the yard. The rocks around it were chipped and worn, but the bucket had been recently moved. She could tell by the marks in the dirt. As she leaned over the well, the faint smell of water rose from below. She didn't see anything unusual, but the handle felt slightly damp. Someone had drawn water not long ago. She stepped back and looked around again, feeling that strange pressure of being observed. She didn't want to panic, but every sign pointed to a person still out there, someone who had chosen not to approach her even after she arrived. Her memory pulled her back to the day she was taken away. It had started with two officials riding onto their land, carrying papers and asking questions she had never heard before. She remembered her father arguing, her mother trying to stay calm, and her own confusion as the officials insisted she had been involved in something that didn't even sound familiar. They never let her speak long enough to explain that she had been at home the day their accusations claimed she had done something elsewhere. Before she understood it, she had been taken into a wagon and hauled away. Her parents' voices had followed her for as long as she could hear them. Now that memory mixed with the silence around her childhood home, forming a knot in her chest. Had those same officials returned? Had something happened because of that mistake? She wished she had more answers, but all she had were questions. She walked back into the barn and sat on a bale of hay. Her horse settled beside her, lowering himself slightly as if to rest, though his ears stayed alert. She stared at the doorway, wondering what she should do next. Leaving wasn't an option. This was her home, or at least it had been, and she wasn't going to abandon it again. She needed to search the house more thoroughly in daylight, look through the drawers, cabinets, records, anything that might tell her what had happened to her family. But the fear of being watched kept her on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone expected her to return, and that her home wasn't as empty as it appeared. She wondered if whoever was out there knew she came back early, knew she would step into the barn before checking anywhere else. If someone had been watching the land, they might have seen her the moment she stepped onto the property. Her horse let out a soft snort, turning his head toward the far end of the barn. She followed his gaze. A shadow shifted behind the wooden boards, but it could have been the wind. She held her breath and listened. Everything went quiet, too quiet, as if the night itself was waiting. She rose slowly and walked to the back of the barn. Her boots made soft thuds on the worn boards. When she reached the wall, she pressed her ear against it. No sound. She pushed the loose plank slightly, only enough to peek through the gap. The open field stretched out, and she saw nothing but the dark outline of a distant tree line. She held the plank a bit longer, listening again. Still nothing. Her horse walked over and nudged her arm, reminding her that she wasn't alone. She turned back toward him and managed a thin smile. The feeling of being watched could be the fear from the long months, she told herself. She had gotten used to eyes on her in the reformatory. Maybe her mind was tricking her into thinking those watchful stares had followed her home. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that there was more to the silence here, more to the house being empty. Her family would never leave the land without a sign, without telling her somehow. If they had been forced out or scared away, she needed to know why. She thought about her father and how steady he had always been. He was not a man who gave up his land easily. He treasured every inch of it, the soil that fed his crops, the fields where horses ran, the barn he built with his own hands. Her mother had planted flowers all around the house, brightening the place with cheerful color every season. None of it looked like the home they cared for so closely. Something big must have happened, something strong enough to break the rhythm of their lives. She stepped outside again and looked toward the road. It was dim under the night sky, but she could see faint tire tracks in the dirt. Wide ones, not from her family's wagon. These tracks were deeper, from something heavier. She followed them with her eyes, but they faded into darkness before she could see where they led. Her breath tightened again. Whoever had been here had driven something large onto the land. And recently, she felt a memory tug at her. Before she was taken away, her father had mentioned a man who tried to buy their land, insisting he needed it for some business venture. Her father had refused and brushed off the man's offer. She never learned what the man wanted the land for. She only remembered that the man had not taken the refusal kindly. Her father mentioned that the man had come back a second time, more tense, claiming that her family was standing in the way of his future plans. Now, with the house empty and signs of a stranger around the barn, the memory pulled at her harder. Was it the same man? Did he return while she was locked away and find no one to stop him? Did he pressure her family until they had no choice but to leave? The questions swirled in her mind with no answers in sight. She walked back toward the barn, wanting to rest but knowing she probably wouldn't sleep tonight. Her horse followed her inside and stood close as she sat down again. She leaned her head against his side, feeling the warmth and comfort she had missed for so long. The barn creaked softly and the wind carried faint sounds across the fields. She tried to listen past her fears, to focus on the steady breathing of the horse beside her. She knew she needed help, but she had no idea who she could trust. The land was quieter than it should be, and that made her cautious. She didn't want to go into town until she understood what happened here. Not everyone in town had believed her innocence before. Some had kept their distance after she was taken away. Returning now without answers could bring more trouble. She let out a slow breath and closed her eyes. This place held everything she loved, and she was not going to let fear drive her away again. Whatever had changed, whatever danger lingered, she needed to face it. But she also needed to be careful. Something was wrong on this land, and until she knew exactly what she was dealing with, she couldn't afford to make the wrong move. Her horse shifted beside her once more, ears pricked. His body tensed slightly as if he heard something she couldn't. She lifted her head and listened in the stillness. Steps in the distance, slow, deliberate, not the wind, not an animal. Someone was out there. She stood, her heartbeat rising again. She moved toward the open barn door but stopped just short of stepping outside. The steps grew clearer, steady and controlled, as if the person making them didn't care if they were heard. She gripped the edge of the door. She didn't know who or what she was about to face. She didn't know if it was the same person who came before she returned, or someone new with questions she wasn't ready to answer. But she knew one thing. The quiet on her land was about to break. She stayed just inside the barn door, holding her breath as the footsteps drew closer. Her horse pressed his nose against her shoulder, urging her to stay calm, though she felt anything but calm. The land had been silent since her return, so the sound of someone walking across the yard was enough to send a prickle up her spine. She waited, her eyes fixed on the dark shape forming at the edge of the lantern's faint glow. A figure stopped a few yards from the barn, close enough to see the outline of shoulders beneath a coat but too far to recognize a face. The person didn't speak, didn't raise a hand, didn't move any closer. They just stood there, watching, the kind of watching that made her skin tighten. She stepped back without thinking. Her horse let out a short, sharp breath as if ready to defend her. She waited for the figure to step forward, to say something, to explain their reason for being there. But the person turned and walked away, their steps fading into the darkness, without hurry, without fear, without even looking back. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. She stayed at the barn door for a long moment, unsure if she should follow or hide. Her heart wouldn't stop pounding, but something inside her refused to let this go. If someone was bold enough to walk onto her land so openly, they were either confident she wouldn't stop them or confident they had a reason to be there. She walked out into the yard a few steps, her eyes scanning the space where the figure had stood. The ground held footprints, deep from boots that carried weight. She knelt to look closer. The tracks were fresh, the edges crisp. Whoever the stranger was, they had been coming here more than once. Her thoughts churned back to her parents. If someone had threatened them or forced them off the land, then the stranger walking around so casually might be connected to it. She imagined her father facing someone like that. He would have stood firm, refusing to sell their ranch or hand over anything without a fight. Her mother would have stayed strong too, though she would have worried more quietly. Standing there in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into trouble that had been brewing long before she returned home. She went back into the barn and closed the door. Her horse snorted again and lowered his head toward her hand. She stroked his neck, trying to steady herself. She knew she needed rest, but sleep wouldn't come easily with so many unanswered questions in her mind. When morning finally came, she pushed open the barn door to see the land more clearly. The daylight brought a different kind of silence, cleaner and less threatening, but still filled with the emptiness she couldn't ignore. The sun cast long light across the fields, showing the worn paths, the aging fences, and the faint tire tracks leading toward the road. She walked toward the house with her horse following close behind. The porch steps creaked when she stepped on them. She entered the house again, determined to look deeper. The thin layer of dust didn't match the tracks she had seen the night before, which meant someone had been in the house too, and not long before she arrived. She checked the kitchen first, opening drawers and cabinets. Everything felt disturbed, as if someone had gone through the place searching for something specific. In the main room, she noticed a small piece of paper near the corner of the fireplace. It didn't look like something her family would have kept. She picked it up carefully. The paper held only a few words written in rushed handwriting. A date, a time, nothing more. But the date wasn't from before she was taken away. It was recent. Too recent. She folded the paper and kept it in her pocket. She didn't understand what it meant, but she needed anything that could help her piece together the truth. Her horse let out a low sound from outside, the kind he made when something caught his attention. She hurried to the doorway and saw him staring toward the far end of the field. She followed his gaze and spotted a small shape moving near the fence. When she walked closer, she saw it was a stray dog, thin and limping. The dog stopped and watched her with wary eyes. Her heart softened despite everything else going on. She approached slowly and knelt down, speaking softly until the dog came close enough to touch her hand. Its fur was dusty and tangled, but it wagged its tail weakly. She scooped it up and held it against her chest. The poor thing looked like it had been wandering the area for days. She carried it back to the barn and gave it some feed mixed with water. Her horse sniffed the dog curiously, as if welcoming another soul in need. She couldn't help thinking the dog might have been left behind the same way her horse had waited for her. It reminded her that the land had once been full of life, of animals and people coming and going, all tied together. Now it felt like a place abandoned by everyone except those who had nowhere else to run. After helping the dog rest, she stepped outside again. The air felt too still, as if holding on to secrets. She remembered the man who wanted to buy the land long before she was taken away. She remembered how her father spoke about him with mistrust. If that man had returned while she was gone, maybe he had pushed harder. Maybe he had done something to force her family to disappear. She looked toward the horizon and wondered where they were now. Had they been driven out? Had they gone willingly to avoid danger? Had they left a sign for her somewhere she hadn't found yet? The thought of them leaving without fighting didn't feel right. Her parents weren't people who gave up, which meant the situation must have been worse than she could imagine. She headed back to the barn to check on the dog and her horse. Both had settled down. The dog curled close to the hay pile, grateful for warmth. Her horse stood guard as if sensing the changes around them. As she watched them, a new thought hit her. What if someone expected her to return? What if taking her away wasn't a mistake at all? What if the reformatory had been part of a plan to remove her from the land? It sounded wild, but so did everything else she had seen so far. The strange tracks, the footprints, the quiet house, the missing parents, the stranger watching her in the night. All of it pointed to something larger than a simple misunderstanding. She remembered the officials who came for her. They claimed they had evidence of her involvement in something she knew nothing about. She never saw that evidence. She was just taken. And now she was back, walking into a situation that felt more dangerous by the hour. Her mind churned with suspicion she didn't want to accept. But the more she tried to push it away, the stronger it felt. Someone had reasons to clear her family off the land. Someone wanted something here. And if they had gone this far already, they weren't likely to give up now. She walked out to the fields again, needing space to think. She followed the fence line, noting the broken boards, the rusted wire, the imbalance that hadn't been there before. Near the far stretch of the land, she noticed an odd patch where the ground seemed disturbed. Fresh dirt, loose and uneven, as if something had been buried or dug up recently. She knelt and touched the soil. It was soft, not packed down by time. Something big had been moved here, a machine maybe, a vehicle. Something strong enough to tear through the land. Her breath tightened again. She rose and stepped back. If someone was coming back to finish whatever they had started, she needed to be ready. She couldn't leave the land yet, not until she understood everything. But she also couldn't stay unprepared. The dog let out a distant bark, pulling her attention back to the barn. She turned and saw the horse standing tense again. She hurried toward them, her heart pounding with a new sense of urgency. The dog kept barking, staring beyond her toward the road. She looked too. A wagon was coming, slow but steady. Someone was returning to her land. Someone who might hold the answers she desperately needed, or the danger she feared the most. The wind pushed harder against her coat as she hurried along the narrow trail, and every step the moray took sent a nervous jolt through her. She kept one hand low on the reins, trying to steady her own breathing, because she could feel the tremor running through the animal beneath her. The forest around them looked darker than before, almost as if the daylight had chosen to hold back. She could hear the faint creak of branches above her and the crunch of frost under the moray's hooves, but behind those sounds lived something else, a quiet shift, a presence she still could not name. She had been heading toward the ridge where the old watchtower stood. She remembered how her father used to take her there when she was young, and he would point out distant trails and tell her how every traveler carried stories on their boots. That memory had been her guide now, urging her to retrace old paths and find whatever truth had been buried under the mess she returned home to. She hoped the high view would give her more than a pretty sight. She needed direction. She needed to see where all these scattered pieces connected. And she needed to understand why someone had been following her since she arrived back in town. The moray gave a soft snort as she felt the tension in its muscles rise again. She rubbed its neck and whispered that they were close. She had rarely seen her loyal horse this shaken, and it left her uneasy. Animals sense things before people did. They felt danger long before it showed its face. If the moray was unsettled, there was a reason. The climb up the ridge was steeper than she remembered. She had to lean forward to keep her balance as the moray pushed through loose dirt and broken roots. When they finally reached the top, she pulled the reins and let the animal rest. The tower stood only a short walk away, its stone worn but strong. She swung off the saddle and tied the moray to a twisted pine before stepping toward the structure. The air felt sharper up here. Wide hills rolled below her with long fences cutting across brown fields. Smoke rose from the far edge of town, and just beyond the river she spotted movement near the abandoned barns. At first she thought it might be workers or travelers, but the shape was wrong, too still, too watchful. Her breath caught. She stepped behind one of the half-broken walls, trying to make herself small. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the figure. Whoever it was stood near her father's old barn, the one that held the storage records he always kept so carefully. The memory of those records returned fast. He used to write details about trade routes, shipments, and every visitor who passed by. When she left for the reformatory, he promised he would teach her how to manage everything once she returned. The promise ached inside her now. If someone was lingering near the records, then they were searching for something. Something important enough to risk returning again and again. And if they wanted those records, then they must have known about the confusion that sent her away and left her father vulnerable. The thought chilled her. She pressed a hand to the rough stone beside her. She was not ready to ride down there, not without understanding more. But she had no intention of turning away either. She needed to stay ahead of whoever had planned all this. The wind shifted. She heard the moray stamping nervously behind her. When she turned, she saw why. A man was walking toward the tower from the opposite side of the ridge, his coat long and his steps slow but sure. He did not try to hide himself. He walked like someone who was used to being seen and feared no consequence. She felt her heart push hard against her ribs. She had not heard him climb the ridge, had not heard his boots on the rocks or his breath in the cold air. He only appeared as if he had been waiting for her to reach this place. She stayed where she was, not wanting to reveal how tense she felt. His face was mostly shadowed by his hat, but the angle of his shoulders and the firmness of his steps told her this meeting was not an accident. He stopped only a few paces from her. "You have been busy since your return." His voice was calm, almost polite, which made it even more unsettling. "Folks in town talk? They say you have been looking in places that were left alone for good reason." She kept her gaze steady. She had learned how to hold her ground in the reformatory. People underestimated quiet strength. "I'm only trying to understand what happened," she replied. "Nothing more." He tilted his head a little, studying her like someone examining an unpredictable animal. "Understanding can be costly. Folks who dig too deep often find things they wish they never touched." She felt anger stir, but she forced her voice to stay level. If someone did wrong, they should answer for it. "That is all I want." He stepped closer, and the mare pulled against the reins, sensing the pressure in the air. The man lowered his voice. "You think the truth will set things right?" "But truth can ruin far more lives than lies ever did." She felt something shift inside her, a certainty. This man knew exactly what sent her away, and he was afraid she would uncover it. Before she could ask anything, he turned and began walking back toward the lower trail as if the conversation had already served its purpose. He did not rush. He acted like she was no threat at all, as though he expected her to stay frozen with doubt. But she stepped forward and called out, "Why frame me? Why target my father? Say it." He paused, but only for a moment. Then he looked over his shoulder and answered with a faint smile that carried no warmth. "Because someone always has to take the fall, and your family made it easy." Her stomach twisted. He walked away after that, descending the ridge slowly, leaving the weight of his words behind him. She felt her jaw tighten as she watched him vanish among the trees. She hurried back to the mare, her fingers shaking as she untied the reins. Whatever she had uncovered so far was only the beginning. This man was not working alone. There were others, and they were watching her every move. They had expected her to stay quiet when she returned. They had expected loss to weaken her, confusion to drown her, fear to pin her in place. But they underestimated something they could never understand. They underestimated what it meant for her to have survived the reformatory. They underestimated the strength she found in the silence of cold nights and the determination that grew each time she was denied a voice. And most of all, they underestimated the bond she had with her loyal horse, the only constant she could rely on. She mounted again, breathing slowly as she steadied her thoughts. The mare swayed under her with restless energy, ready to run. She leaned low and whispered that they would not be hunted, not now, not ever. She directed the mare down the far side of the ridge, away from the tower, away from the man who thought he could intimidate her. She needed to reach the river and circle toward the barns without using the main roads. She needed to see what had drawn that figure there and why those records mattered so much. As she rode, the sky grew darker and the cold deepened. She could feel tension pushing its way into her chest, a warning that danger was closing in. Every sound in the forest felt sharper. Every shadow seemed to move. She reached the riverbank and slowed the mare, letting it drink for a moment. She scanned the area. The path ahead wound through a cluster of tall grass and abandoned fences. Beyond that stood the barns, silhouettes against the fading light. Something flickered near the first barn. A lantern. Someone was inside? She tightened her grip on the reins. She could not see who it was. She had no way of knowing whether it was the watcher she saw earlier or someone else entirely. But she knew one truth clearly now. Whatever waited in that barn was tied to everything she had lost, and she had come too far to turn away. She nudged the mare forward, the cold air biting at her face. Each step brought her closer to the truth, closer to danger, closer to the moment she would finally confront whoever had torn her life apart. She reached the outer fence and stopped. The lantern inside the barn swayed gently as if someone had passed by it. She listened, her breath held tight. A single door hinge groaned from within. Then a shadow moved across the crack of light at the bottom of the door. She felt the chill run down her spine as she realized she was no longer the one sneaking up on answers. She was the one being waited for. She stayed still behind the fence, trying to steady her breath as the shadow slipped across the barn door again. Her heart felt loud enough to give her away, but she kept her hands calm on the reins. The mare shifted beneath her, uneasy but ready to respond the moment she made a choice. She leaned closer, whispering for the animal to stay quiet. Then she swung her leg over and stepped down, boots brushing against the cold dirt. The air smelled of dry straw and old wood, the kind that held memories even when everything else around it changed. She moved slowly toward the barn, each step measured. She reached for the old latch and pushed gently, letting the door open just enough to slip inside. The lantern on the beam threw a warm glow around the room, revealing stacks of crates, tools, and her father's marked ledger boxes. The boxes were untouched. That alone told her the intruder had not yet found what they came for. The shadow she saw belonged to someone standing near the far stall. She took another step before the person turned. It was an older man she recognized, one of the workers who used to help her father during harvest seasons. His coat looked worn and his face carried worry more than threat. He raised his hands when he saw her. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly. "I came because I knew they were watching the place again." She felt confusion and relief mix inside her. "Why would you risk coming here?" she asked. "Because I owed your father more than I ever said," he answered. "And because I knew someone would try to twist the truth once he wasn't around to protect it." His words hit her harder than she was ready for. She stepped closer, urged by the need to understand. He glanced toward the ledger boxes. "They hold proof," he said. "Proof of every agreement, every shipment, every trade he made, and proof of the one shipment that went wrong, the one they blamed on you." She clenched her jaw, remembering the accusations that dragged her away to the reformatory, a missing crate. Missing reports, missing signatures. She had been the easiest target to blame. They said she tampered with records. They claimed she hid the shipment. She had tried to defend herself, but nobody listened. The mistake, the injustice, the long months behind locked doors still pressed on her chest. The older man reached into his coat and pulled out a single folded page. "This is the part they didn't want anyone to see," he whispered. He handed it to her. She opened it carefully. It was a letter addressed to her father. The signature at the bottom belonged to the same man who confronted her on the ridge. It was a confession in a way, though written with careful wording. It confirmed that a different worker had mishandled the shipment and disappeared after taking payment meant for the farm. The letter asked her father to stay silent to avoid conflict within the trade council. She felt the truth settle heavily in her hands. "They framed you because you were young and they thought you would stay quiet," the older man added. "They didn't expect you to fight for answers. They thought your father would protect their secret. And when he passed, they thought it was done." Her throat tightened. Anger, grief, and relief mixed in a way she couldn't name. She stared at the page, letting the weight of it sink into her shaking fingers. All the long nights in the reformatory, all the days she spent fearing she would never clear her name, every unanswered question she carried home had been tied to this secret. She folded the letter and tucked it inside her coat. Before she could speak, the barn door creaked again. She spun around and her heart jumped. The man from the ridge stepped inside, his eyes cold but his mouth forming a calm smile like before. "So here we are," he said. "You were always too curious for your own good, but this time something in her had changed." She no longer felt small or powerless. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "I have what I need. I know what really happened. And I will not be silent." The older man beside her moved closer, standing between the stranger and the ledger boxes. The intruder's expression shifted as he realized things had turned against him. He talked about danger on the ridge. He talked about truth being costly. But now it was clear he feared the truth more than anyone. "You think people will believe you?" he asked. "You think a single letter changes anything?" "They will when the council sees it," she replied. "They will when they check the records and see who signed off the night the shipment vanished." He stepped back, frustration tightening his features. "You don't understand how deep this goes," he said. "There are others who will protect themselves. You are fighting the wrong people." She took a breath. "No, I am fighting the right ones. And I am not alone anymore." At that moment, her mare pushed its head through the open door, snorting loudly. The stranger startled, and the older man acted fast. He grabbed a shovel leaning against the stall and struck the lantern hook, sending the light swinging wildly. The sudden burst of motion caught the stranger off guard. She moved forward, pushing him toward the door as the mare reared slightly, blocking his path back inside. He stumbled out into the yard, his boots scraping hard against the dirt. When he regained balance, he glared at her, the anger finally cracking through his composed surface. "This isn't over," he hissed. She stood straight. "It is for me." The stranger turned and hurried into the trees, disappearing faster than she expected for someone who acted untouchable. She watched until the shadows swallowed him completely. Only then did she exhale the breath she had been holding. Inside the barn, the older man steadied the lantern. The room settled into a softer glow again. She thanked him for helping her. He nodded, but his eyes carried a sorrow that made her pause. "I wish your father could see you now," he said quietly. "He would be proud." She lowered her gaze for a moment, letting the warmth of those words settle in her chest. She felt the mare nudge her shoulder gently, as if sensing her emotions. She brushed the animal's face, grateful for its loyalty. No matter how the world had shifted around her, this horse had remained her one constant. It had carried her when she came home to loss and confusion. It had been her strength in the darkest moments. She took the ledger boxes and the letter, knowing they were the final pieces she needed. Together, she and the older man left the barn and walked into the open air. The cold felt different now. It no longer stung. It felt clean, clear. The next days passed with a steady purpose. She brought the records to the council. She spoke firmly, peacefully, and with undeniable proof. There were arguments. There were those who tried to talk around the truth. But the letter and the ledgers stood stronger than any excuses they offered. In the end, they could not deny what had been done to her. Her name was cleared. Her father's legacy restored. And those who had hidden behind lies were forced to face what they had done. When she stood outside afterward, the mare waited quietly by the hitching post. She reached up and stroked its mane. "You carried me through everything," she whispered. "And now we can breathe again." She decided not to stay in town. The grief of what she had lost was still heavy, but the truth had given her a new beginning. She chose to rebuild her father's land, not out of fear or duty, but out of love. The older man offered to help for the season, and others eventually returned too, people who respected her father and wanted to see the land thrive again. In time, the fields looked alive once more. The barns felt warm again, and she felt her own spirit settle into something steadier than she had known in years. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned with quiet color, she stood with her mare by the fence line. The wind moved softly across the grass. She watched the land stretch wide before her, peaceful and strong. She realized then that the reformatory had not broken her, the lies had not silenced her. Loss had not taken away her purpose. She had come home to hardship, to confusion, to a world changed without warning. But she had also come home to truth, to loyalty, and to the one companion who had waited for her without fail. She rested her hand on the mare's neck and smiled. Whatever came next, she knew she could face it. The past had finally settled. The future felt open again. And in that wide quiet, she felt the story close in a simple, steady way. Not with triumph shouted loud, but with peace earned honestly. The kind her father always believed she would find one day.